Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. So welcome to Face to Face. Our guest today is a friend of mine, as you've probably noticed in the past. I would imagine eventually in the future some of our guests won't be friends of mine, or at least personal friends of mine. But Rahim is here from Horizons Exchange Mutual Funds? Traded Funds. There you go. Thanks for joining us, Eden.
David, thank you very much. I look forward to this.
So it's a conversation. It's a bit of an interview. Eden has an incredibly interesting and eclectic past. He's a guy who loves economics. He's working in the mutual fund market. I would imagine he might, add a footnote or two to that. I would think.
Sure.
And but he also loves philosophy, and I think that's how Eden and I connected some time ago. We both have a love for existentialism, for German, French, Danish existentialism, but in particular, Kierkegaard is a philosopher that we both personally connected with. So I want to talk a little bit about economics. We're going to talk about philosophy. We're going to talk about life and incremental change. So again, Eden, thanks for joining us.
This is great.
So one of the things I've always found fascinating about you is your education. You studied molecular genetics. How is that a part of the puzzle?
Well, it started out back in 1980. I was in high school. I saw Genentech go public, and it looked like a dynamic new field. I was actually going to go into engineering, and I switched specialties and did my undergrad in molecular genetics. And while at U of T, I did a minor in philosophy along the way.
What was the draw towards genetics?
It was a novel field. It was a new frontier. It was the next emerging innovative thing to come on the scene. And I've always been attracted to that. There's something very, very appealing about the next innovative thing to come on the scene that's going to change the world. And as it's turned out, that's what happened.
So in the next innovative thing, I mean, you couldn't be in a more innovative field, really, in a sense. Mutual funds, the financial world, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess they were in parallel, because each generation there is some field that basically dominates the society. In the prior generation would have been manufacturing. In prior generations would have been agriculture. It just so happens that in just this generation was finance, and the next generation will be something else. So I'm one of the very, very fortunate people in this world that I think has managed to do one or two things that he absolutely loves. To have a job that is innovating, that you want to wake up to every morning, and I'm very fortunate with that. Combining biotech and finance.
So would you say that, I mean, to me, I know nothing, zero about molecular genetics. Would you say that's about the details in a way? I mean, most scientists, I suppose, are sort of fascinated and focused on details. There's an element of curiosity there. For all their rampant rationalism and objectivity, I could argue that they're philosophers of a particular sort. Is there a connection there between the financial world and being a molecular geneticist?
Not a direct comparison, other than the fact that both fields were emerging. For both, there was a tremendous amount of creativity that was required as these fields emerged. So, in the case of biotech, what it was doing is you were taking drug development down to a whole new level, down to the level of the DNA in the cell. Prior to that, in the pharmaceutical industry, most of the drugs were chemically based. So we were moving to an entirely new level where you could address chronic and fatal diseases in a way that was inconceivable prior to this technology. Similarly, with finance, I was involved in derivatives and what is basically a form of financial engineering. So what you're able to do is take finance and take it to a whole new level where you can create securities and instruments that can mitigate risk or distribute risk or create different payoffs that are desirable by investors. So both were very creative, both were very involved. And
so it's almost like at a higher level or a lower foundational level, there's a direct connection.
Absolutely.
But as you start to unpack it, maybe not so much.
Absolutely.
So are you one of the guys that I get to blame based on Inside Job? The documentary film? I'm assuming you've seen it?
I have, and as you know, I was one of those critics of the entire financial system and the incentives that were built into the system that created the crisis. I was somewhat of a Cassandra in the years prior to that, from all our lengthy conversations discussing that the crisis was inevitable. And it was inevitable based on the fact that there was a payoff incentive across all levels, from government through those on Wall Street, where no one had a direct stake in protecting the system. And once you have that sort of order of magnitude, a system will collapse like this. It wasn't 2 or 3 years in the making. It was 20 years in the making.
Right.
And it's the nature of risk where people will at first be very prudent in taking risks, but then as time goes by and policies come into place that protects investors from the consequences of certain risk, then they're willing to take more risk because someone else is there to absorb the risk that they otherwise would have borne.
Which is so funny. It almost sounds like an analytical, philosophical thought experiment.
Absolutely.
As long as somebody else takes the risk, I'm willing to take some risk. Well, then it's not really risk anymore, is it?
Well, that's exactly right. And if you don't perceive it as risk, then your behavior becomes reckless.
Right. So now we're talking about things like intuition and psychology and relationship and so on. It's no longer this supposedly quantifiable thing, but it's very much based on human behavior or in this case, misbehavior.
Well, and that's a great way of putting it, because when a market is orderly and behaves well, there are a series of checks and balances in place. It self-corrects. So it'll go up by 3 steps, correct by 2 steps, up by 3, down by 2. But then as policies come into place to protect you from the 2 steps back or from any crises that arise, then your behavior changes. Then you're willing to take on more risk. You're willing to commit more to the trend. You're willing to borrow money to participate in the trend. And that's exactly what happened. So it really began over 20 years ago when the market crashed in 1987. And the Federal Reserve stepped in and said, we will provide all credit necessary to all borrowers and all market makers. That in itself, the road to hell is always paved with good intentions. And it was well-intentioned. We understood why it was there. But then they kept the policy in place. And that collectively changed your behavior. And then we saw this again in the crisis of 1998 with the failure of long-term capital. Again, the Federal Reserve and the government intervened. And that became a pattern of behavior. So at that point, investors started to understand, I can take on as much risk, but someone will cover me and pay the consequences of that. And that is what led to the real estate bubble, to the NASDAQ bubble, and the subsequent credit collapse in 2008, 2009. So it wasn't one day in the making or a few years in the making. It was 20 years in the making.
So Eden, is the fundamental problem here, are we really just talking, you and I have joked about over the years Adam Smith, and, we've talked about the invisible hand and, all these sort of almost financial cliches, I suppose, in a way. Is the fundamental problem Gordon Gekko's problem, which was greed?
Greed is a natural part of the market in the sense that the market will oscillate between greed and fear. It always has. For hundreds of years, it always has. The problem really arises when there's an aspect called moral suasion. And moral suasion arises when you behave in such a way that you feel your risk is being covered by someone else. And that, more than anything else, is really, you can lay that blame at the door of the Federal Reserve. It's what they did was they bailed out the banks. The banks made reckless loans. They made extraordinary risks, and they benefited immensely from the bailout. So when the crisis arose, the Federal Reserve bailed out the equity holders and the bondholders in the banks. So, we've seen coming out of this crisis, a gap between the 1% and the 99% actually widen. It should have actually contracted because the equity holders should have been allowed to fail, the bondholders should have been allowed to fail, but the depositors in these banks protected. They did the exact opposite. They protected the equity holders, they protected the bondholders, and the executives became wealthier than they had ever dreamed of coming out of this crisis.
So for you, justice would have, in a sense, financial fiscal justice would have been the market self-correcting, as you say.
Yes.
And most of these folks either wound up in jail or they lost their fortunes, and that would that be self-correction in a sense?
That's absolutely right. One of the attributes of a free market is failure. Failure is necessary because failure impacts your decision-making going forward.
Right.
If you extricate failure from the equation, your behavior changes. And that's what happens.
So there's a part of me that, we've joked about this, the whole notion of markets being self-corrective. To me, there's a anthropomorphism there. There's a humanity to the market that I don't believe exists.
Yep.
And yet, I think you would in a debate, if we were in a debate together, and you would stand your ground on that and say, well, hang on a second here. We're talking about a community of people. It's not about this inanimate object called the market, but is that right? Is that fair?
Well, it's twofold. There are people involved, and these are individuals like you and I, and they have families, and they're decent people. The market in itself is entirely different. The market is agnostic. The market goes where it's treated best. So if the market is treated badly, either with higher taxes or higher interest rates, it will allocate capital elsewhere. And that's how it allocates. So it's really indifferent in terms of good or bad or anything like that.
Right.
It just flows like a river flows downhill.
Yeah.
Capital flows where it's treated best.
You speak like it though about it though like there's an intentionality to it that I find quite remarkable and frankly a little troubling. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's not that it's intentional because it doesn't have a grand plan, or it's not visionary to see where it's going. It's really more a function of, okay, take something as simple as real rates. Real rates.
Which is so funny because I have no idea what a real rate is.
Real rate is the actual interest rate when you subtract inflation from it.
Okay. I'm already confused.
Okay. Yeah. So you've got interest rates of 5% and inflation of 2%. You've got a real rate of 5 minus 2 equals 3.
3%. Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So that's the real interest rate after money devalues, which is inflation. So if you have a real interest rate like you did during the 80s and 90s, then earnings assets and yielding assets outperform. So stocks and bonds outperformed in the 80s and 90s. When the Federal Reserve started to ease interest rates about a decade ago, real interest rates fell to negative. That benefits non-yielding assets, right? So commodities, stuff like that. So we've seen crude oil go from $10 in late 1990s to $150 at the high. We saw gold go from $250 in 2001 to as high as $1,900. We saw steel prices soar. We saw other commodities soar. That's what happens when real interest rates fall. Now, these commodities or assets don't know that they're going to go that way. It's just that this hurdle rate, this threshold, that changes the incentive to invest in one asset or the other is completely market driven.
So would you call it almost in a way crowd behavior?
It's crowd behavior comes in afterward. When a trend has persisted for a long period of time, that's when crowd behavior comes in.
But isn't the market's self-directed notion based on some sort of crowd I don't even know what word I'm looking for here, but I was going to go with intention, but you've already sort of said it's not intentional in that sense, but crowd behavior, I guess.
Crowd behavior. The market, most of the time, in a trend is rational. It ebbs and flows. it rallies, it self-corrects across all asset classes. But there comes a point when policies come into place, interest rates are kept too low, credit is made too available, where the self-correcting nature of the market transitions. There is a what's that term? Where you cross a threshold, where the behavior changes.
Red line in a way?
Sort of.
Yeah.
And so that's when corrective behavior turns into herding behavior.
Herding as in H-E-R-D?
Yes, H-E-R-D-I-N-G. So that's where you become, it starts to act like a crowd. Because then what happens is the behavior changes. So when the market's self-correcting, everyone's rational. Okay, you buy corn at the grocery store. When the price doubles, you don't buy the same quantity of corn. You actually buy less of that corn because you've got the constant dollar, or crude, or your gasoline prices go up.
Yep.
You cut back on the miles you drive,
right? Because
you've got a budget to stay. That's rational behavior.
Right.
What happens in asset classes like equities or bonds or commodities is there comes a point when the trend persists, something flips, and it becomes a herding behavior. So now, instead of being rational in your decision making, you are not turned away by higher rising prices. You actually become more emboldened.
So I'm wondering, and we can do away with this line of thought in a second, but would I be a part of the herd behavior in the sense that I know enough to be dangerous when it comes to economics, when it comes to fund management and so on? So I see some sort of trend occurring out there. I see what the market is doing, and when I say market, it comes with footnotes and italics.
Sure.
And I go, wow, look at all these people making money. I jump on the bandwagon. I'm the one who kind of screws it up. I'm the guy who starts redlining, I suppose. Yeah. If we can use the phrase I used earlier.
You actually said it very eloquently, because that's precisely what happens when you transition to a herding stage. It's usually the least informed that commit to the trend, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. Because these are people that are rational in every aspect of their behavior, but then they transition to something else.
So in a sense,
you remember the Cabbage Patch phenomenon?
Of course,
right?
Yeah.
When rational people would fly across London to get the last Cabbage Patch and so on, it becomes a self-feeding frenzy.
Yeah.
And we've seen that before. We've seen in all sorts of things, and that's a classic case in point. Rational people commit to a trend because they hear stories about other people making money easily, and it becomes compelling.
Yeah.
And that's the unfortunate nature of markets, and it always ends that way.
The whole self-feeding frenzy comment you just made reminds me of a quote by Emil Fackenheim, who said that under capitalism, people devour people, and under communism, it's the other way around. Every time it comes up, I don't see it very often, but it's awesome. It's just, there's something about it that just, shoots us all down. It kind of levels the playing field.
Human nature is human nature. It never changes.
Yeah. No, it doesn't seem to. Yeah. I'd like to think it does. Yeah. Working in development and working in those kinds of issues.
Human nature in terms of crowding behavior.
Oh, I see. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, good.
Yeah, not on an individual level.
Yeah, right.
That's definitely
So
different.
you still believe in change?
Oh, absolutely. I believe in change.
Yeah. So why, how the heck, pray tell, did you get involved with Kierkegaard?
Well, while I was taking molecular genetics at U of T, I did minor in philosophy, and I was taking a moral philosophy class. And part of that, one of the assignments was to really critique his premise that truth is subjectivity. So I went at it with fervor to disprove truth is subjectivity, and the more I delved into it, the more I became spellbound by it.
So was this the supposed scientist and rationalist in you saying, I just can't buy this guy?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good way of saying it, because there was an empiricist buried deep inside of me that led me to take moral philosophy, because you basically assumed that there was a definite black and white between good and bad, right and wrong. And Kierkegaard threw a monkey wrench into that.
Right.
And it was so extraordinary that I picked up the Brettl anthology, which I think is 500 odd pages, and I read through that in a couple of days. And I knew there was no looking back at that point.
So this was a secondary source, somebody commenting about Kierkegaard and so on. What was the first of Kierkegaard's writings that you read?
It would have to be Fear and Trembling.
Yeah, it seems to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, it's exceptional because one of the truly revolutionary things that he said in Fear and Trembling is who is closer to the truth. The pagan who passionately sacrifices while in the nature of untruth to a cause he strongly believes in, versus a self-righteous religious person who unctuously believes that they are in possession of the truth and no one else, and is scoffing at the pagan.
Right.
And he asked this very simple question: who is closer to the truth? And it's really fundamental in an existential quest to define values that you can live and die by.
So I tell my students all the time that it's rarely either or.
That's right.
And I mean, it's a title by Kierkegaard for those who've read him, for those who know. Is that kind of what he meant? That it's not about black and white. It's not about objectivity. And maybe you can tease out the whole notion of truth as subjectivity as well, because I know that's often misunderstood.
Yes.
You know, this idea that truth is subjective. Well, what do you mean truth is subjective? And I think too often we polarize. Too often we tend towards it's black, it's white, it's up, it's down, it's positive, it's negative. And I think we miss all the nuances. We miss the subtleties of what this all really is.
Yes.
And we lose out on relationships, and we lose out on an understanding. And I've made the distinction before that it's not about comprehension, it's about apprehension. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. I think that the aspect of Kierkegaard that really appealed to me at the beginning was that objective truths are in themselves approximations. We typically sort of default accepting them as absolutes, but they are themselves approximations, and as such, we are spectators to those truths. I can't know everything cognitively, so how do I know when I know enough or that I know the correct things? And analytical methods that we use in science really can't apply to an individual in trying to figure out himself. And so I think the quest for some sort of authentic truth is really at the basis of what Kierkegaard was trying to separate a world that was very modernist, very industrializing, and had fallen in love with its ability to move forward in society. And yet he was born into a system, a religious structure, where certain groups were confident in their possession of truth. And yet he went about actually disarming that entire structure to explain that truth is an existential quest.
So it's not what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. That's not what it's reduced to, is it? Or is it more than that?
No, I think it really is. In searching for truth, we want. It's not so much the what of the truth. It's not the merit of the truth that can be appraised by someone else and judged by someone else. It's really the why of what we're doing that matters more.
Well, and this is existentialism, it seems to me. This is freedom, this is choice, this is responsibility.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, isn't that... And this is the irony of the question, I think, of mine earlier about intentionality in the market. I mean, Kierkegaard would say it's all about intentionality, wouldn't he?
Yep, it's about intentionality, but even in discussing freedom and truth, we can have freedom of speech, we can have freedom from shackles of a cell wall. But, you take someone like Mandela or Solzhenitsyn or Bonhoeffer. Were they unfree men? They were perhaps the most free of men, even though they were shackled in prison. You contrast that with a tyrant who himself has absolute power over everyone, and yet is paranoid about holding on to his power.
Right.
And so who is really free here? And so I think the nature of freedom is not bounded by political systems, systems of justice. In the end, freedom is something truly inward, something that you make of examining what your possibility can be.
So Kierkegaard would have said that you don't catch the truth, you don't reach out and grasp it, but it kind of grasps you. Can you talk a bit about that, how that's played out in your own life?
Sure, and that is my favorite Kierkegaard quote. It's actually the quote that I use on my Twitter as my description.
What's your Twitter handle, by the way?
I think it's at Eden Rahim.
At Eden Rahim. That's EDENRAHIM.
That's right.
Yeah. How often do you tweet, Eden?
Probably once a day.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's an eclectic range of philosophy, film, finance.
Oh, okay. So it's kind of a fun thing as well for you. It's not just about business.
No, not at all. In fact, I really try to keep the business at a minimum.
Oh, okay.
It's really more about film and philosophy and thoughts and a bit of sport.
And by the way, I want to get back to film. We had talked earlier before the recording started about Children of Men, so I want to come back to that as well. But
sure.
So talk to me about how truth catches you.
Yeah, how it comes from perspective. We, as it stands right now, we all look at truth as something that we agree about. We look at it out there. We select it. Yes, I like that truth. Or someone has told me that this is true. And so we choose truths and values from a buffet.
Right, as if it sits on a library shelf.
Exactly, as if it sits on a library shelf.
Yep.
Or it's been absolutely taught to us. And we accept it, and we're able to act in such a way because they're given truths. We act with a clear conscience, so we don't examine our actions specifically in relation to every act. So instead, we end up saying, "Well, because this is true, and I accept this to be true because it's been taught to me. I've been told it. Someone much smarter than me has explained it to me." We just accept it. So it really we're looking at truth objectively, and what the impact of that is that we can now do things with a clear conscience because it's been sanctioned, it's been legitimized. Now, if you extrapolate that out to the negative scenario, is that we look around the world and history of mankind, and so many atrocities have been committed by people with supposedly good intentions, or people appealing to a transcendent faith, or people who believe that truth is on their side, and they're able to commit things, atrocities, and go to sleep with a clear conscience.
Mein Kampf, Hitler actually says, I mean, I don't know what the direct quote is, I can't recall it right now. The mere fact that I've read the book is troubling on certain levels. But he talks about being called by God on some level, and this is a part of the plan, this final solution. I mean, the hubris and the ego and the...
Completely.
It's just, you watch a documentary about it, you read about these things, Joseph Kony. I mean, there's so many, Pol Pot, there's so many others, and you just say, how do you even get there?
That's right.
You know, it's astounding.
Yeah, and
not in a good way.
And in each of these societies, you had a charismatic person that gave hope to people.
Right.
So they suspended their own existential decisions on the belief that this person understood better or more clearly or had a plan, right? Exploiting their desperate state. And that's, you know, and regrettably, I think what Kierkegaard is asking us to do is defer against that. Every decision you make should be someone that is reflected on inwardly. And in that decision, the person that is impacted by a decision is treated as a subject, not an object. In all of these top-down systems, everyone is objectified.
So for a guy who, it sounds to me like his philosophy was highly relational, I mean, I think Kierkegaard would say you can't know yourself unless
Completely.
you are involved in a community of some kind. That you know you know yourself to the degree to which your wife or your friends or your family around you are impacting you in some way, shape, or form.
Yes.
I mean, he really was a loner, wasn't he?
He was a loner in some sense, and it's a funny thing about individuals is maybe by being alone he was able to reflect on this more clearly and articulate it more clearly, and we all stood to benefit from it.
Right.
And but he was a loner, and he definitely grew up in a very, very austere, brooding household. But I think that despite that, the hope that he gave to every single individual in their ability to determine who they become, in their possibilities, and to overcome the despair that is a natural result of the conflict of trying to create someone who you are not.
Right.
I think it's extraordinary.
Right. Yeah, not to get into too much quoting of earlier philosophers and so on, but I can't help but think of de Beauvoir's ethics of ambiguity, and how she talks about, being thrown into the world not of her own making.
Yes.
And for me, that was a real pivotal moment in my it was my master's degree, and just reading philosophy, this idea of we've been tossed into it, and it had nothing to do with us.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of a holy shit moment.
Yeah.
It's kind of a, wow, now what?
Yeah.
My parents lied to me. My school lied to me. My church lied to me. My friends and family have lied to me. Now what?
Yes.
And how do I react to that? And so Kierkegaard is saying, hang on, if we started from this truth of subjectivity perspective and said it's about inwardness, it's about reflection and so on, things could be really different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're no longer at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
You are no longer compromised. You are no longer a victim.
Right. So we're back to responsibility.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, it's interesting, Eden. I mean, that I have young kids. I have a 5 and a 7-year-old, and my joke is that I want to screw them up as little as possible.
which was always my aim as a father.
That's
which
right.
Is just do as little damage as possible.
I mean, we're all carrying a truckload of baggage.
Yes.
Right? I think we're talking about the make and the shape and the contents.
Yes.
I mean, the reality is we've all got it. So how we're going to... But I'm being very intentional about trying to create this sense of freedom within them, and artistic and religious and relational freedom, but this sense of choice and responsibility as well. And that, and I hope we're on the right path. And I agree with you. I mean, I think if worldwide we had this sense, instead of acquiescing towards something else.
Yes.
That's supposedly higher up, that's supposedly out there in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
It's more about the here and now. It's more about the present moment, and that's Anyway, I'm kind of babbling now, I suppose.
I understand what you're saying, and it makes sense. And you know what? If you take every decision as if, I think Kant had said that if you take a decision and you treat it as if it can become a universal law, right? So now you're constantly thinking in terms of how this impacts someone else, right? Then you act authentically to that person's benefit.
Right. He was talking about the categorical.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And one of the dilemmas that Kierkegaard was expert at was explaining that when we are not sincere, or we try to avoid that inwardness, a genuine, authentic, genuine inwardness, that it leads us to despair, because we become a conflicted individual.
Right.
And at some point he says, you think about a beautiful woman, how she's dealing with aging. You think about a wealthy man who's lost his wealth. You think about, in the modern times, you think about an intellectual who wants to make a name for himself so that he'll be immortal, and it's not coming to fruition. You think about an extrovert who no longer has an audience to communicate. All these things create a sense of despair, because you're trying to create an inward person in an outward form. and we're not being sincere with ourselves.
Right. And that's what de Beauvoir's point is, almost identical in the sense that she said, so we realize we've been thrown into this world, not of our own making. We have this holy smokes moment, and we say, now what?
Yes.
And then we create this sort of faux human being.
Yes.
In order to run from what she calls our freedom.
Yeah.
And I mean, essentially, that's the main tenet of existentialism, really, isn't it?
Completely.
I mean, it's, so you shared a few quotes with me and for today's talk, and one of them I think is absolutely beautiful. Quote, Eric Fromm, quote, "The quest for certainty blocks the search for meaning. Uncertainty is a very condition to impel man to unfold his powers," close quote. I mean, it's beautiful for a whole lot of reasons, poetic and just literary. Can you unpack that a little bit? I mean, aren't we all looking for certainty of one kind or another?
Yeah, I think our natural state is always yearning for certainty, and that leads us into making decisions that have far-reaching consequences.
Right.
Now, this is where the nature of markets has something to teach us, because uncertainty is the backbone of markets. All we do in markets is try to find certainty amidst a sea of uncertainty. We try and invent systems of analysis, all sorts of means, securities to protect against uncertainty. It drives the entire industry of finance. But similarly, on an individual level, our quest for certainty is we're looking for financial certainty, we're looking for religious certainty, we're looking for certainty in that we're loved by someone. We found a mate that loves us. So we're looking for that, and it's a perilous road, because that's the road where you make decisions that last a lifetime, and you can make inauthentic decisions because the quest for certainty takes precedence, and it's a very tight balance. Excuse me. That is at the heart of existentialism, to find that balance in the quest for certainty. So certainty is really a myth. At brief periods in our life, we may have certainty about something because you created an edifice or a structure that makes us feel safe within that period. But then we know what happens in life. Fate happens.
I'm going to go back to de Beauvoir. That's exactly what children realize at some point. I think her direct quote in the opening of chapter 2 of the book, and boy, am I now looking like a nerd, but man's unhappiness is due to his first having been a child.
Yes.
And so at some point in our life, whether it's 10, 11, 12, 13, we have that holy smokes moment and go, wow, we've been lied to.
Yes.
And I didn't have anything to do with this.
Yes.
And again, now what the heck am I going to do with it?
Yep.
And she argues, as do most of the existentialists, we all run from that.
Yep.
And we end up with Pol Pot, and we end up with, crazy financial markets and extreme poverty. It's really quite incredible. I mean, to see how this notion of relationship and authenticity seems to be kind of connected to everything.
Absolutely.
In a way.
It's a foundation. Everything else is governed by humans acting.
Yeah.
So I think if you take it from the single individual outward, right? Single individuals behave a certain way. Collectively, that gets manifested outward.
Sure. In
the markets that they participate in, that gets manifested as well. And so I think that's a connectedness that's in here, and that's why often...
Which is so ironic, because isn't that what we're all trying to get to in some way, shape, or form? I mean, it's certainly what I believe, is this idea of connectedness.
Yes.
Is this sense of loss that we have. It's this sense of despair that we actually, kind of don't recognize.
Yes. And
we're filling it in one way, shape, or form with so many different things. Kind of that God-shaped hole that Pascal talks about.
Yep.
So we're getting close to the end of our time, but tell me about Children of Men. So we both love film. We've seen many together. We've certainly spent many hours talking about great films. Would you say it's in the top 10 for you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I love Children of Men because for many, it's not really the reasons that a lot of other people like it. I realize it's a dystopian view of humanity.
It's pretty dark.
It is very dark, and it gets darker. Ultimately concluding with some hope. But more than anything else, I like character-driven film. And in the case of Children of Men, here you have this very unassuming who turns out to be a hero and never really recognizes that. But this unassuming character, played by Clive Owen, who's actually withdrawing from life, day by day withdrawing from life, is extremely cynical. It's quite hopeless, and is thrust in circumstantially and unwittingly into making small decisions that he has no grand plan of. He doesn't see where it's leading. He doesn't even see it as meritorious. But small little decisions, existential decisions made one after the other. Nothing noble, nothing heroic about them, but they start to add up into something. And then he sees his life start to form, but again, it's an unfinished work, as all lives are. It's always unfinished. It's really always a work in progress. And so you've got this grand theme that's unfolding in the plot of the film, but the attraction to me really was the development of that character. As he went through, as he made decisions, small decisions, some bad decisions, some good decisions. Well, bad and good as measured by the ultimate outcome. But decisions are decisions. We don't know whether they're bad or they're good. It's what you make of it, I guess, really what matters. And so it's really quite a favorite of mine, in addition to the great soundtrack.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it really, I mean, cinematography, the whole thing, I mean, it's just really quite a gritty little piece.
Yeah, I think you had actually pointed out there was a scene in there that lasted 7 or 8 minutes that was filmed. It's a very difficult scene to film.
Right. There is a battle scene where it's all one take, and I think at one point blood actually splashes up onto the lens of the camera, and the director chose to keep going. And I don't know. There's this dark, edgy kind of realism to that that you don't often see in movies. And on some level, I was going to say I've got to respect that, but I just really admire it, and it makes the experience so much more enjoyable for me.
And one of the other beautiful things about that scene is that you have these polarized groups. You've got totalitarian regime who themselves think they're acting rationally and doing the right thing, and then you've got a subversive group that's fighting for the remnants of humanity. But at that moment where the baby is going through, they both subside.
Right.
There's a higher good that they all think.
Right. So for a brief moment, they all get it.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah, they all get it for a brief moment, and that's I guess that's the cynical realism of the film that just bears down on it in the sense that we're kind of screwed if we don't get it.
Yep.
You know what's so ironic about Children of Men is that so many people, I think, would see it as a dark kind of cynical piece that's very dystopic and unrelenting in its dismissal of humanity, and yet at the same point, I mean, I think it's entirely hopeful.
Absolutely.
And kind of cliche at the end, I suppose, but in a way, but it really is about how to become more human.
Yeah.
So I would love for you to talk a little. You used to work for a major bank in Canada, and I've often smiled to myself about a story that you told me about a decision that you had to make that ended up turned out to be an amazing decision, and you made millions of dollars on this one decision, and yet you talk about anxiety and despair and can you tell us a little bit about that story and how it shaped who you are from an existential sense in a way? And I'll let you tip the story.
Was that when I puked into the basket?
That's when you puked into the basket. Okay. I was hoping you were going to say that. Yeah, exactly.
So you wanted me to say it?
I wanted you to say it. I was going to say it, but I thought, you know what? I'm going to let Eden lead on this one.
Oh, good. Great. It's on record as having said that.
That's right, yeah. It's a fantastic story for so many reasons, because I think it humanizes what you do. I have trouble. I don't get what you do, in a way. I think I'd rather have bamboo shoots shoved up my fingernails.
I've felt that many a time.
That's right, than do what you do. But you know what? There's a part of me that I go, wow, I'm just glad there are people out there that like this, because it seems to sort of hold something together. And I don't have time for that, So anyway, so thanks.
This was the fall of 1998. The long-term capital had collapsed. The Russian ruble had collapsed and Russia defaulted. Markets had dropped about 30-odd% in 3 months. And 3 months earlier at the top, I had become a portfolio manager for a growth fund. And the first thing, I was bearish. So the first thing I did was liquidate a huge volume of stocks in a portfolio to raise my cash level. So I was up to about 20% cash, which in the mutual fund world is an enormous amount of cash. The market collapsed, and around early mid-October, I started to reverse my position by buying futures contracts to use up the cash. So I was turning bullish, even though there was blood in the streets. It was very bleak. Everything was crumbling around me. I turned around. I went long 287 TSX 35 futures, and
correct me up. You lost me about 45 seconds ago, but
sorry
anyway.
about that. So I had taken as much pain as I could take, and just as I think I heard a saying, it turns black just before dawn,
right?
Or it turns just before it.
It's darkest before the dawn.
It's darkest before the dawn, and when I couldn't take it anymore, I got the worst news imaginable. A trader phoned me up and said he had 300 futures to go, and there was no bid. So at the time, it looked like it was just a monumental bad bet on my part. I couldn't take it anymore. I literally puked into the waste paper basket.
Just from the tension, the
just
stress,
from the tension, sickened to the core.
The what if?
I was a young portfolio manager at the time, and I was just sickened to the core, and that was the bottom. The market literally bottomed about 5 minutes later. I was up 35% in the next few months, and I turned what was an absolutely horrific trade, sickening to the core, turned out to be one of my best trades of my life.
So, and you made millions, didn't you? For the fund, yes. For the fund, yeah.
Yes.
You yourself personally didn't.
I wish I did.
So, yeah, exactly. So, a huge upswing, ultimately positive.
Yes.
A way forward, all those things.
Yeah.
What do you take? What do you take from that? I mean, is it that, we don't need to invoke Kierkegaard necessarily, but is it about, taking the leap? Is it about making that decision? Is it about committing? What kind of lesson do you learn from something like that?
That's actually very difficult to assess.
Keep an airsick bag handy?
Yes, I think that more than anything else.
I mean, it's a great story for so many reasons, and I think there are lessons to be learned there, but I'm just not 100% sure what they are yet.
Yeah, and I've reflected on it a lot. I've had lots of trades in my life, and I have a penchant for marching against the crowd that we talked about at the beginning, and positioning against the crowd, and invariably I'm almost early, so I end up taking a fair amount of pain standing against the crowd at inflection points, and my behavior hasn't changed much since in my career. As we talked about over the years, I was super bearish on U.S. real estate, a year and a half too early. And I paid dearly for that, being short U.S. real estate stocks too early. But many of these stocks went to zero. And that was a case in point. So the only lesson is that you understand when something has gone too far, but you don't know how far it can go against you first.
How about, so let me go a little cliche, Kierkegaardian and cliche.
Yeah.
You really don't get it until you look back, right?
That's right.
So you can reflect now a little bit more on that, and yet maybe there's not quite enough time between 1998 and now that's passed for you to really make sense of that. Maybe in 10 more years we'll have another conversation and you'll go, you know what, David? Here's why.
Well, you know why they're good old days. The only reason why they're good old days, it's because it turned out you made it through.
Right.
And you can look back at the time that you're going through it, they weren't good days.
So I'm gonna close this off with another quote you shared with me. George Soros.
Yes.
Philanthropist. Right?
Philanthropist and probably the greatest hedge fund manager ever.
So there you go. So almost a contradiction in a way. and somebody who certainly appeals to my heart because, he's obviously been a part, not just of giving away a lot of money, but also a catalyst for, I would say, a significant amount of change globally.
Absolutely. And he uses money for that. And he was strongly influenced by Karl Popper.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay, from a philosophical point of view. So he says, markets, quote, markets are constantly in a state of uncertainty and flux, and money is made by discounting the obvious and betting on the unexpected, close quote. Pretty interesting coming from a guy who's now, I think, trying to eradicate extreme poverty, trying to give back to this notion of the greater good. I mean, it's wonderful and I think infuriating all at the same time. Deliciously infuriating.
Yeah. I think you have to accept that with anyone that crosses over, because to operate in the markets requires a certain discipline, requires a certain acceptance of what the rules of the game are, and they aren't necessarily the same rules that apply elsewhere.
Right.
And to his credit, he's decided that philanthropy is an important use of the funds that he was able to make in a market. I'm not going to say he's Robin Hood, but I'm just saying it's just a good use of transferring that money to a greater good. And few people have been able to amass the wealth he has, understanding financial markets, and he is clever enough to understand that the rules of life or the rules of human nature elsewhere aren't precisely the same as would be required here.
Right. I guess the cynics would say, easy for him to say after making so much money.
Sure.
The same with Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. Isn't it marvelous what they're doing? But I'll do that too once I'm a billionaire.
Yeah, you know what? The one thing we learn is it's always easy to be a critic and to say, if I were in his shoes, I would have done this, I would have done that. And it turns out that, again, the Kierkegaardian response to that is, let's see you do what you can with what you have right now, today. You, the single individual. Once you've trained yourself to perhaps give until it hurts, or give to such a point where you're not contented of having given enough, but are willing to do more, when you can do that with your life now, then we'll see what you can do when you've amassed a fortune.
Nice.
So you can do what you can with what you have today.
What a great way to end an awesome conversation and interview. Thank you for chatting and for sharing some of your insights and the puke story. That was big for me.
It was a lot of fun, David.
I'm sure we'll talk about it again. Thanks, Eden.
Great, thank you.
Do you want, Eden, just before we go, you want to talk about, I've forgotten the name of your company.
Oh, it's Horizons Exchange Traded Funds. I manage 13 covered call ETFs, 4 commodity, and that's 13 minus 4. That's 9 equity ETFs in Australia and in Canada, and we're launching into the US in a few months.
And the website is?
horizonsetfs.com.
Thanks for joining us today on Face to Face.
My pleasure.